everybody, and welcome to Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. My guest for today's episode is Tim of WookPlus, also known by his Twitter handle @WeekendWook. If you've engaged with the fish community on Twitter over the past 2 or 3 years, there's no doubt that you've come across one of Tim's fish brackets, in which songs, tours, or venues are pitted against one another round-robin style to compete for the title of Best. When I first encountered the bracket 2 years ago, I was immediately intrigued. I had to get to know the person behind Competitive Fish, and Tim was gracious enough to accept my invite to come on the pod. If you haven't engaged with Fish Twitter, now is the time to do it, as the 2021 Fish Song Bracket Tournament is underway. Follow @WeekendWook and join in the fun. For today's episode, Tim chose to discuss Fish's show on July 27th, 2014 at Merriweather Post Pavilion in Columbia, Maryland. Opening with a strong set, the band really brought things to another level with the 3.0 version of Tweezerfest throughout set 2. Certainly a notable show and one of the best of 2014. In this episode, Tim talks about his intentions behind the fish brackets, his engagement party that was a part of this show, theories on why the band does or doesn't plan ahead, and the benefits and disadvantages of bringing friends to their first show. So reserve your Merriweather parking pass in advance, get to the lot early to avoid the garage, and make a stop at Wegman's for pregame food, as we join Tim from WookPlus to take a look back at July 27th, 2014 at Merriweather Post. Tim, welcome to Attendance Bias. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Brian?
I'm very excited to talk to you today for several reasons. Of course, the show that you picked of Merriweather Post on July 27th, 2014, what I would call the modern Tweezerfest.
Tweezerfest reprise.
Tweezerfest reprise. But also because I've been a really staunch follower and fan of the brackets that you've put together for the last couple of years. And as I take them and I look over Twitter and comment and rack my brain, I just need to know a little bit about the mind behind them. To learn a little bit about you, before we get into the heavy music stuff, you grew up on the Jersey Shore and now you live outside Philly. What kind of music did you grow up listening to?
Once you get out of the kid stuff, right? Like there's like the Fisher Price toy kid, like whatever. But when you actually get into real music, yeah. I think it started classic rock. You know, that was kind of really common with like my friends. We got into like Zeppelin and stuff, and then grunge. My first tape was Nirvana, and then from there I went into like this very short heavy metal phase where I was like in between like classic like Metallica and then more into like the Rage. And then my brother was he's 5 years older than me. He's a huge Fish fan, and he brought home Slip, Stitch, and Pass. So this gives you an idea. I guess around 97 was the first time I had heard Fish.
What about Slip, Stitch, and Pass grabbed you?
It's kind of weird in hindsight, but it was Way. The first song I heard was Way, and I'm a drummer, so it wasn't even the weirdness. Like I've heard people say like, oh, the quirkiness or the weirdness in the lyrics is what drew them in, but it was the groove of it because it had like this swing and a funk, right? Like that, like and like the balance of the music and the groove that there's first time hearing it, the subtleties in that I hadn't heard in rock music.
And then you want to dive more into it. And so you told me that your first show was at Bonnaroo in 2009. At what point, like what happened in the space between getting into Fish with Slip, Stitch, and Pass and Bonnaroo?
Slip, Stitch, and Pass 97, I was just too young, right? Like I didn't really have the opportunity to go to shows. And then in high school, I was one of those overachievers, just really involved. And I remember I had a couple of opportunities in 2.0. That's when I was in high school to see shows. But I was like drum major of the band. I was in jazz band. I had my own band. You know, I was like in theater. I did all the really hyper involved, and all of those things had camps and shit during the summer. And the first tickets I ever had were for Coventry. But I remember this was right after high school. But I remember I had something in the family. It was some emergency. And I had to make a choice, and I chose not to go. And I remember thinking afterwards how I made the right decision, because I might have been the end of my fandom. So basically, I had to wait then that whole hiatus that's when I was in college. Those were my prime years and I couldn't see. So I got really heavy into Mo. I saw probably 40 or 50 Mo shows during those years. In between, I started seeing Humphreys and a couple other bands. And then by summer 09, it was like, it wasn't a stumble upon anymore, right? Like you were like, the slingshot had been pulled back and just holding for years and then, launched out as soon as they came back.
It's funny because we have almost parallel lives about this. I'm guessing I'm about 4 or 5 years older than you. And when I graduated high school in 2000 and I got to college, that was right around when they took their first hiatus. So when you mentioned that slingshot analogy, that was me in college. And it's like, all right, now we have a car. Now we don't really have to care about class, I thought.
Right.
And we have the freedom. I was in Buffalo, so I was closer to the Midwest where there were a lot of shows. And then they went off for 18 months. And then they were gone.
Right during that prime time of touring that you really could have been racking up a bunch of shows and having a great time.
Yeah. And then when Phish came back, when they announced it in 2008 and came back in the spring of 2009, everyone was just primed. It was like, okay, now let's step up our game a little bit. And that in my life was when I had just gotten my first full-time teaching job. So I had a real salary and I had summers off. So you were ready to get going in 2009. So was I. And so 2009, that was Bonnaroo. They headlined that festival. What are some of your memories from their set or from the weekend in general?
Maybe it'll give you a clue as to what substances and other things were involved. But my biggest memory from that weekend was the rain, the sound of the rain. I think it rained night 3. I forget if it was night 2 or 3, but Bruce Springsteen had come out on stage with Phish. He was the other headliner. And I couldn't even hear Bruce singing or playing. All I heard were these, like a million raindrops coming down. It was cool seeing Phish in a festival setting, I think, for somebody that came into it with my point of view of having, because by that point I had listened to, dozens of shows and watched Bittersweet Motel and you know what I mean? Like I was like a junkie. So like seeing them, I had watched footage of Clifford Ball, and Grey Wen and everything. So then like seeing them in that big field, it felt super satisfying to what your expectations were. Like other people complain now, okay, they're doing a festival set, right? They're giving you all the big hits and everything. But for your first time seeing them after building it up in your head, seeing all the big, Phish jams in that setting was really, I think, satisfying and I wasn't let down at all, right? Like you just kept going from there.
So it must have been a lot of fun. And I'm sure the vibe there was just off the charts because it was an opportunity for everyone who hadn't seen them in those 5 years to go, if they could make it to Bonnaroo, of course. But there was no like ticket limit. Bonnaroo might sell out, but it's not hard to get in.
And the other shows that summer were hard, I think. It was tough to get tickets overall that summer.
Yeah, and that was a major summer tour. They played a huge summer tour in 2009. What first got me interested in having you on the show and connected us was your Twitter account, Weekend Wook. And it's at Weekend Wook, right? Yep.
And there's weekendwook.com, although that's phasing out to WookPlus.com. But yeah, it's a whole media conglomerate.
Yeah. You and Rupert Murdoch side by side. The part that really zoned me in was the brackets, the Weekend Wook brackets. And for anyone who doesn't know, who's listening and isn't aware of it, can you tell us what the Weekend Wook brackets are?
I put jam-centric topics head-to-head and give you binary choices, mainly to cause melts. I mean, we put it under the guise of figuring out the best, but the real motivation is to motivate conversation and discourse and to laugh a little bit, right? It's funny to see people get really upset about things that are not that serious.
And it's tremendous.
Honestly, these days you kind of lost that, right? Like it started a couple of years ago, and I think it was more fun to have trolling and people getting upset. But now it's like shit is serious. So
Phish has always been serious business, as we all know.
Very serious.
But I love it so much. I think it's so much fun. And personally, I feel that, that delight when I see two shows that I love pressed up against each other, or one that I've never heard before, like the Alpine 2019 Alpine Valley show that all I know about it is Ruby Waves up against like a 97 fall tour.
That's
show.
Definitely a benefit of the brackets, even for myself, is the exposing yourself to new things that you hadn't heard. Like it started with the song bracket. We did one with 320 Fish songs, and honestly, probably 300 of them I knew very well. But even at that level, you're like digging deep into the catalog, and then the tour brackets, and now the show bracket. So that kind of revealing hidden gems is fun. It's cool though. I think of it, and I don't want to overly, tout it. It's not like the Mona Lisa or whatever, but I like the brackets because it's a two-pronged thing for me. It's a psychology experiment and it's an art installment, right? Like the actual design and the graphics and the visuals of the bracket is very satisfying creatively because I'm an engineer by trade, right? So I design things. So I think in a very analytical way, but it's also very artistic in my opinion, right? There's a lot of creativity in it. But then once it's created, that's like the first phase. Then it turns into this living, breathing thing where you know that when you're creating it, you're going to create certain matchups and discussions and see how people react.
Well, when I start to vote, sometimes I go, how did we get here? Yeah, how did this happen? It was something that you mentioned earlier about how it kind of forces a fan to really dig in, to really look up, like on the Fish show. I'm sorry, the Fish song bracket. If you asked me to sing My Left Toe off the top of my head, I probably couldn't. And I've seen it live. But
yeah, probably not. I don't think I could either.
But
you say that.
But it makes me go back and listen. And something else I wrote in that article, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I wrote that they challenge my long-held opinions and assumptions, that it's obvious to me that Fall 97, if you include the holiday run, is their best tour ever. But when was the last time that I really did a deep dive into Summer 93 and not just August 93? The bracket, it gives me the perfect reason to revisit jams and shows and tours even, or maybe coming up venues. And there are some shows and tours where their reputation and their legacies have been like calcified in my head, in my Fish rankings personally. And sometimes it's like, wait a minute, you got to revisit this. Like, what's the point of faith if you don't challenge it every once in a while?
And it's interesting to me because I always had a very specific calcified ranking or view of things that I thought was widely accepted. And that was the way, you know what I mean? Like, this is the way. That's like Fall 97 is a perfect example, right? And there are those individual outliers, like Big Cypress, as far as festivals and New Year's Eve is the outlier. It's obviously the one that gets voted for. Fall 97, I don't think anyone questioned that was going to win the tour bracket. Tweezer and Yem were going to be the top two songs. But the best part about the interesting thing to me is how diverse it is after you get out of that point, right? Like, I thought everybody else was going to have the same calcified rankings, and it's the 50-50 matchups, the amount of 50-50 matchups that was the biggest surprise to me. There's most of the brackets. I think probably every single bracket has had at least a couple straight 50-50 results, which is crazy because you think everybody's so opinionated and there's one right answer, but there's really not. And I think if I did the same brackets again, they may flip.
And there never has been a right answer is the delightful part. What the brackets also do for me is it's on my phone screen, it's on Twitter, but it's the same exact thing as sitting around a grill in a parking lot before the show when you had a big group of fans in their beach chairs or whatever. We would all go around and we'd argue. It's obviously easier to do it in good nature when you're in person than when you are on Twitter, and people get a little nasty, or could. If I were a little bit of an older fan and I started saying how Fall 95, nothing like it, you weren't there, so you don't know. And someone else says, yeah, well, Fall 2013 was sick. You probably didn't even like the band up to that point. It's the same conversations you have. It's just now it's online and it involves everybody who wants to instead of whoever could fit in your car.
Also, there's a voyeur. I don't mean not to make it inappropriate, but like sometimes I don't have the energy to be part of those conversations and give my opinion, but I like listening to people argue those things, right? So there's also that, because it's kind of like this public dynamic growing content, and you could go in. I still go back and look at some of the discussions on some of them, right? Because you're capturing those discussions in a public forum, which is neat.
I thought I knew my stuff. And then I looked at some of the conversations going on in the brackets, and damn, I got to go back to the library.
Yeah, you and me both. I think that because I create a lot of it, sometimes people think that I know all of the shows or all the entries perfectly off the top of my head. And the truth is that a lot of work, a lot of research, I have this little algorithm to like help rank things based on different metrics. So a lot of it is I'm kind of figuring it out with everybody else. Like I probably know more than somebody who's not done that, because it feeds off naturally. But I'm like you, I can't pull dates or stats out of my head like that.
And that's why I wanted to have you on the show to talk about a show that you've been to. And right before we get there, I wanted to wrap this section up about one more thing. Your Twitter feed from Weekend Wook eventually morphed, or had an offshoot, I guess you could say, to WookPlus. Can you tell us a little bit about what WookPlus is?
Yeah, so WookPlus is a YouTube channel at its heart. I mean, it also involves a blog, and it's a group of us. There's 5 of us that collaborate. And basically about a year ago, right before New Year's 2020, the Rescue Squad, I put out a call on Twitter, and I was like, hey, I'm going to start a YouTube channel, because that was kind of a missing sector in like fish fan content, right? There's podcasts, there's blogs, there's Twitter accounts, but there was only like 1 or 2 guys doing anything on YouTube. And it turns out I figured out why. It's because it's really hard to do YouTube content. Everything gets striked for copyright claims. So anyway, I put out a call. A bunch of people responded. We started coming up with content, and here we are a year later. It's really, I think, been a fun experiment. I don't know if it's been successful or not. I don't know what metric that is, but we're going to keep it going because we're having a blast with it.
Well, speaking as someone who's tried to start up a project to put out there for fans, if you're having fun and you enjoy it and it's satisfying to you, then it's a success. In 2014, for all intents and purposes, the summer was the Fuego tour. Although the band like kind of debuted the album the previous fall as Wingsuit in Atlantic City for Halloween, it was officially released in June 2014, right before the tour started in Great Woods on July 1st. And Fuego was played at 13 out of 25 shows this tour. And set lists were littered with other songs from the album. Waiting All Night was a pretty common song to catch that year. Wingsuit, The Line, 555 kind of made its presence known in the first set. Winter Queen occasionally. I wish they would play Sing Monica more often, but that's just me. I'll vote for that one in the next song bracket. But for me personally, 2014 wasn't a particularly memorable Phish year. I saw the 2 shows at the Man, 2 out of 3 shows at Randall's Island, 2 out of the 4 shows in Miami. And that was it. I remember hearing about the Wedge at Northerly Island in Chicago. That was a superior version. I think still probably the best version they've ever played. And of course, Randall's Island, that was, a superior run. But this show that you picked today, July 27th, what led you up to July 27th at Merriweather Post?
So I had been living with my girlfriend from college, and we had just gotten engaged. And that's actually one of the reasons I chose this, was because we had our engagement party that weekend. But before I get into that, it's funny what you're saying about Fuego everywhere. It was kind of the same thing as the 09-10 year of getting Numberline everywhere, right? So I actually liked Fuego right off the bat and loved 14 because of all the Fuegos. It was the opposite with Joy. I hated Joy when it first came out, and now it's switched. I would love to get a Numberline, and I listen to Joy more than I do Fuego. But at the time, I loved Fuego. I loved everything about it. So I was probably one of the few people that really dug the amount of Fuegos that we got that year. But yeah, no. So I guess leading into that show, my wife's family lives in Annapolis, so that's the whole Maryland connection. We were trying to figure out a way to connect our engagement party with that mini run. And what we ultimately decided to do was have a family party during the day and then travel with the friends, like because grandparents and aunts and uncles didn't come, but everyone else, all our groomsmen and bridesmaid came with us from the party and went to the fish show and continued. I guess you could say it's more of an after party than the actual party. But it was a fun weekend.
Are they into fish? The groomsmen and the bridesmaids? Yeah. So the people who came with you?
Probably half and half. Like my brother was one of my groomsmen. He was there, and a couple of my other buddies were, but not everyone. But you know what? They were respectful though. And it's funny because I feel like if you see Fish live, you have no choice but to become a fan. And that weekend was like one of the best shows I'd seen, and it didn't work on some of them. So that's not true. Not everybody is meant to be a Fish fan, right? Yeah, like not everybody that came there drank the Kool-Aid, but they were respectful. They weren't talking, or they had fun.
And that's what it's about in the end. I personally think I agree with you that it's not for everyone. But I think everyone should try it once.
Yeah, because, I remember distinctly my buddy that's not a Fish fan saying, I don't get it, but I get why you get it, right? Like that was the difference. Is like he didn't enjoy it, but he could see all around him that many people on the same wavelength. And he's like, I see what's alluring about it for you. So the whole idea of an engagement party is like they're all there to support the new couple, the new marriage and everything. And so they were very supportive, and it was great having friends there. I have not brought non-fans to a show since, and I never will, just because there's a certain ease when you have a crew that knows what they're doing. Right. And we were almost missed the opening. Right. It was hard getting drinks and stuff. I'm not a big crew with a bunch of amateur kind of guy anymore. Like I like having my 4-person, it's usually like a couple, me and my wife, and then our best friends also go to shows. And like we hit the bathrooms, we hit the vending, we get our seats, you know what I mean? Like it's very efficient. So I don't know.
You're all pro
now. I don't want to be bringing noobs.
So let's get right into the show. Set 1 opens with Fee, which I always think is a great opener. And someone on the audience recording, if you listen back to it, is tremendously thrilled right at the beginning. And he must be standing right next to the mic. And they've only played it 5 times since.
Well, it's cool because you see the mega, is that what it's called? Megaphone?
It's a megaphone, yeah.
Right behind him before he comes out on stage. Because I don't know if it actually sits out there I've seen a couple shows where it's out there and they don't use it. So, but it's not always there, right? So I guess it has to be an inkling in his mind before the show that it's a possibility. But when you see it first set before they come out, half of the fans are like, we're getting a Fee. And then when they actually go into it, I think that's what the elation is. I don't think it's necessarily that everybody's like, fuck yeah, I got a Fee. I think they called it, and to their less experienced fans, it's impressive. So everybody's like, haha.
And also Trey forgot one of the lines, which makes it a real Fee, in my opinion, either Fee or Cavern. He's
they stopped and went back into it, right?
Yes, and you could tell immediately that the band is feeling loose right away. I think Trey even says something like, I remembered it, just not in the right order when they came back to it, because he skipped a verse and went back to it. And the song ends right there. They don't really end it just after he forgets it and comebacks in, and then goes to the curtain, which is awesome.
Yeah, and it was really well done, if I remember, especially for that year. There was a lot of mistakes I remember in shows around that year, and I feel like, if I remember correctly, I mean, I haven't listened to it super recently, but I think Curtain Width they really nailed. Later in this show, they actually had some mistakes that kind of derail things. So to have these couple of gems in the middle of the first set was pretty cool. That's definitely you're gonna have a good show, right? You get that and you feel good.
And it ends before the jam gets too deep. The curtain does. And they go right into a nice shot of energy with 46 Days. And it's kind of similar in the curtain in that it's strong, usual version that Trey ends before it goes out there. And so far, to me, it seems kind of like a good jukebox show. Kind of like when you were talking about Bonnaroo, like a lot of good songs just hitting you one after the other.
Yeah. This is a song that gets the non-Fish fans loosened up, right? Sure. Because Fee, it's like skeptical. Everybody's like, well, all right, from that perspective, what's going on? Current Width, it's like, all right, that's a lot of notes, but I don't know if you're not really musical if you get it. But then 46 Days kind of like just like a classic rock raging, type song. And I think that's what loosened up the rest of our party.
They followed up with 555, which got a lot of play in 2014. I looked it up. They played it 18 times in 41 shows. So that's like just under half. And then right into My Sweet One, which is one of my favorites.
Yeah, I agree. 555 is okay. I don't really have much to contribute to that. I mean, I never hate it, but I never like really remember it, right? When you catch it at a show. My Sweet One's the opposite. I think that was probably the highlight of the first set for me. And it's not that it was a spectacular My Sweet One, but just the fact that it was My Sweet One. And
it's your engagement party.
Right. And it's both like the obvious, like, oh, I love you, you're my sweet one, but also that like rowdy, we're at a party, we're jumping around, we're dancing, like, so yeah, I think that was a very good moment in that set.
And then things change around a little bit with Sand, where before that it was a lot of like short and sweet, straightforward single songs, and Sand, it was a really smooth whole band groove, and it does wander off quite a bit. This is really where you're going to see who has the metal for this and who doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. And pretty much any of the new guys were lost at that point. But at that point, I didn't care, right? That's where I got sucked in, and I no longer was at my engagement party, and I was with my wife at a Fish show, or my fiance at a Fish show.
Right. It's your party, yeah. But there are parts where it really does experiment a little bit.
I agree. Well, it's a good vehicle too. It's a very tight, repetitive groove, and that happens a bunch of times with Fish songs, right? But those tend to be the best vehicles because it gives a nice bed for Trey and Paige. Usually Trey first, and then Paige slides in to play around on. After
Sand, Bouncing Around the Room comes around, and it's good. It's a good follow-up to what I thought so far was the best jam of the show in Sand.
Do you like Bouncing Around the Room?
I do.
Okay. I think that's one of these weird ones that like the lure of, or the feedback I was getting about the song before I had even seen the band live tainted it for me, right? Because like I had my brother's groups of friends, they were all Fish heads, and that was kind of like the number line of the day, or I guess now it's like Soul Planet from the way I remember people describing it to me, right? Like it was kind of when it came out, it was like the poppier thing. And even though I enjoy listening to it, it's always been kind of tainted because of things I heard when I was really little, right? Described the way Bouncing was described to me before I even knew the band has now tainted the way I view that song 20 years later. I don't know.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I agree about the placement though. It was a perfectly placed kind of breath in that set.
And then after Bouncing, they played Saw It Again, which is a crowd favorite for sure.
Yeah, and I think the breakdown when it goes like in the halftime, the bow,
yeah.
that is in a live setting with the live speakers, when you already have that energy, is just kind of like a mini eruption, I think, right? It's not like the hood eruption with the glow sticks, but it's just like everybody's in sync in the same motion. It has that, it punctuates the crowd, I feel, right? Everybody kind of headbangs at the same time and jumps, and it was really getting fun, I think, at that point.
Yeah, you could feel it. I wasn't there, but listening to the audience recording, you could feel it. You could hear the crowd, not quite over the music, but within the music.
Yeah.
That it's kind of joining together. Yeah, right. After that, now it's time for Fuego. You get a Fuego and you get a Fuego. And this is when the song, I think, this is my take on Fuego, that in the beginning, I love the Halloween version. I was at that Wingsuit show and I thought it was the best song that they played that night. I loved it. I loved it. And this tour was when the song was still exciting and it could lead to really big show highlight jams. But then toward the end of the tour, even, and now, it sometimes feel like they're kind of forcing it a little bit, like they're leaving the end a little too wide open.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny you say that, because I was saying that earlier, how I started off being a very big fan of the album and the song, and I'm not as much anymore. And I never actually contributed that to them changing the way they play it. But it makes sense because it felt tighter and it felt more fresh early on. Like there was more opportunity or possibility with it, I guess. I do love Fish in that song, though. That drum beat, it's not a super intricate drum beat, but it's fairly intricate.
Are you talking about when he speeds up?
Yeah, when it breaks down, it's like, I can't drum use it, but yeah, when it's just Fish. And it goes into the fast part. Yeah,
right before the organ comes in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love that drum line.
And I love it too. I think that the band's harmonies work very well on it, even though it's kind of cheesy classic rock. That part.
Yeah. On a quick aside, are you familiar with Let's Go?
Yes, it's a Mike Gordon song, right?
Yeah,
they played it a couple times.
Yeah, just a couple. And when I heard it the first time, I was so into it. I was like, man, I hope they like bring this back a dozen times, and they never brought it back. But I agree. There's a reason some of that cheese is popular, right? And it's the same thing is with Fuego. It's fun to chant like that and to be all on the same page and have that communal experience.
And then they close the whole set with You Enjoy Myself.
Yeah, and it was good. And I think that is sometimes Fish has to pay, or Trey at least has to pay a little bit of like dividends to the older fans, you know what I mean? Or hardcore fans. Like he still does it. Like they'll cram a Soul Planet or Everything's Right or something and then they'll bring back a hood. And I feel like that Yem was just like, okay, we've given you a lot. We gave you 555. We gave you Fuego. It's like, we're here. Let's bring it back to the origins. I don't know. Maybe that's a cynical way of looking at it, but it feels like he has to bring it back sometimes.
I thought the opposite, because this set, when you really break it down, has a lot of hardcore fan sort of songs, like Fee and the Curtain, just to kick it off.
Oh yeah.
You don't hear those every day. Saw It Again isn't that common. And so once I think, hold on, I'm looking for the rest of the set that I had written out. I think I lost track of it. Oh, here it is. My Sweet One is an old song. That's also, I think, 1990. I think it was on Lawn Boy, I think, and Bouncing Around the Room.
All right, I stand corrected.
No, I'm not trying to correct you, because I hear what you're saying, but I think it's not cynical though what you said, because
and I also don't think it's a bad thing. I like that he does that, and maybe that's just I'm overthinking it, but it always feels like that, right?
A Fish fan overthinking something?
A Fish fan on a podcast overthinking
something. But I think that it's also worth noting that Fish, of course, is a rock band. They're a premier rock band. They play top line venues, and they had a new album out.
Yeah.
555 and Fuego, it would be weird if they didn't play newer songs. But back to the point, You Enjoy Myself is a really nice bow on any set.
I think that's what it is. I think they are a rock band, but they're also Fish. And I think that's what it is. It's not paying to a specific fan. It's paying to the authenticity of the band and the choices they make, and that they have to make some of those. I mean, and it's not a bad thing, right? Like, you have to introduce the new music. You have to keep it fresh. Otherwise it dies. But I think there is something to going back to what established them and the original works.
And do you remember what the vibe was among your group at Set Break at all?
No, at that point, I think I was really focused on my fiance at the time, and and the music. I probably should have been a better host, but I think at that point I was pretty, I think, intoxicated because we had pre-partied right with the family party, and it was such a fun first set that I think it was they're all grown-ups, like everybody fends for themselves.
Is she overhearing you?
Yeah, she's chiming in.
She could chime in if she wants. There's plenty of room here.
Oh, she's reminding me that one of her friends was attractive. So all of my friends that were not into Fish started fighting over her friend. But anyway, to my point, I didn't notice any of that was going on because I was a Fish fan and into the band.
Set 2 opens with Wilson, which is almost never in the second set, let alone to open it. So that must have been really fun.
Yeah, I think that's here we go type moment, right? Like, you get that baba and instantly it sets the setup for success. Something had to have happened in hindsight at Set Break, because I mean, it'll become more obvious as we go through the second set. But they always like what they're doing, but some shows really stand out as just loose fun where the band just loves what they're doing. Like, they don't give a shit who's watching. They just love jamming and being together and putting on a show. And that second set, from top to bottom, from the first notes of Wilson all the way to the end, was them having a blast and loving what they were doing.
It seems that way because the first set I thought was satisfying, if not spectacular, but the second set really was spectacular. And that designation, or at least that thought from me, really started with the next song, obviously, which was the beginning of this whole Tweezer snake that went all the way through the set. And I broke it down this way, that the first section was Tweezer to Back on the Train, back into Tweezer, back on the train, and then Tweezer again. It was like this crazy club sandwich of a set list.
Yeah, and it was seamless. And that's not, in my opinion, easy songs to segue, right? Like, there's some songs that you can very easily segue back and forth, like Fire on the Mountain with Meat Stick. If you were to do that, it's the same structure, the same rhythm, everything. You're just slightly changing words. But this is an entirely different groove and feel, and I think Fish led it, and he had to. No one else could have led those transitions. I think that's what makes it unique, right? Because as like Tweezer is more raging back and forth, head bopping, right, and then Back on the Train is a very uppity, poppy, like
almost like a bluegrass drum beat,
right? Exactly. And you going back and listening to those transitions, it's brilliant, but it's also very obvious, right? There's that, and that's what was fun about it, is you have the moment you click, and now he's in the Back on the Train section, and click, it's back in the Tweezer, and click, it's back on the train. And you could hear, when you listen to the audience recording of it, the eruptions every time, right? It wasn't that figuring out, what are they going into now, that they sometimes do with segues, where that in itself is cool, that it organically grows. This was sharp transitions back and forth, and it was just a party. Everybody was in on it and having a great time.
I agree 100% with everything you just said. In the beginning of it, you could hear it's almost like flirting, like between Fishman and Trey. Like, you could hear Fishman double up on the beat for like 4 bars and then go back to the regular Tweezer drum beat.
Yeah.
And then next time he does it again, and then the band joins in for like half a second, like they're making a connection, like you're on a date or something, and you both laugh and smile, but then you go back to pleasant conversation. By the Uncle Ebenezer section of Tweezer, it's like immediately after that, they're totally committed.
I feel like they were in sync for the rest of the show. Like that initial discourse locked them in and made them listen even more than they typically do, I guess. I don't know. They were locked in from that point on.
Absolutely. And this whole first chunk between Tweezer and Back on the Train, it really explores. It goes to a lot of places. There's this great Bliss major key jamming. The last Tweezer is like a preview of what would come in 2015, where there was a lot of chord-based rhythm up major key jamming. Also, I wrote in my notes, this is the goods. And the spontaneity of it only makes it better.
Yeah, and it was kind of unexpected. I mean, well, we haven't gotten quite there yet. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
When it comes back, that is when it really, I think, was like, holy shit. Because you got this motif of Tweezer back on the train, Tweezer back on the train. I forget how many times, right? And then what did they go into after that?
It was Back on the Train and Tweezer. They almost had this kind of Manteca jam. It didn't quite go into Manteca, but there was this rhythm almost 7 or 8 minutes in. It's very dense, and then it kind of dissipates. It kind of chills out, and then they start Waiting All Night out of the ether, kind of.
Right, which is a page turn. It feels like, okay, that was a cool way to open the set. Now we're doing this new song that's kind of like a very produced, poppier. I don't know. Like I love Waiting All Night, but it's a different feel.
It is. It's kind of like an adult contemporary NPR song to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's a funny and accurate way to describe it. And then it was Free, and then that's when the oh shit I was referring to was back into Tweezer, and to have that palate cleanser of Waiting All Night and thinking you're going in a different direction, and then just to pull back and tie the whole thing in was really, really cool. A really cool moment.
It's my favorite part of seeing Fish, in that you might, if they just went from Free and moved forward and the rest of the set was great, you would probably walk out of Merriweather saying, oh man, that opening of the second set was great. Like Tweezer Back on the Train, that was so much fun. And you keep going. But the fact that they started Free, and during those bass fills, the dun, 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 that part, that's when Trey decided to introduce Tweezer back in. That makes it a living set. Yeah. You don't know where it's going to go, and everyone's on the edge of their seat, but also blown away and delighted, where, like you mentioned, the crowd roaring every time.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about it at the time, but I wonder what it was like from the perspective of people that had never been to a Fish show.
Right?
Like they were like, the first set was like, okay, everybody's dancing and having a party, and now the cult side of Fish, right? Like everybody's just losing their fucking mind, on the same thing, and like that must have been wild for those people to see that.
So Free, right when Mike's bass fills, and they usually go into a bit of a jam at that part, they go back into Tweezer and then into Simple. So like we've left the reservation now.
Yeah, there's no rules, there's no right, it's like you said, it's open at this point. And
there was some small jamming before the transition back into Tweezer after Simple. And then it was like a 1 minute stopover. And then they pick up Free again to close it out. I think it's incredible that they pick up Free like right where they left off. Because if you quizzed me even when I was just driving my car or listening on my couch, okay, where in Free did we end? I would have no idea. I would not be able to tell you.
Yeah.
Because I'm just flowing with the music, but the band knows instantly where to pick it back up to finish the song.
Yeah, and I wonder if that was premeditated. Like, do you think this whole transition, was this planned? Because I know in the beginning it felt like a catch, you know, like putting the bait out and flirting. But then were they just really on a different level with these transitions? And not just for this show, but in general, or is some of it premeditated? It feels premeditated just for how tight and insane it is. But at the same time, it feels like, I don't know, maybe they're just that good and on the same wavelength.
I'd like to believe that they're just that good and on the same wavelength.
Well, and I think it's a trust level too, where as soon as one of them takes a step over the edge, the rest of them go with them. There's no question. Yeah. There's no doubting. And I don't think you get that really in life anymore or with other bands, but even just on like a bigger picture, right? Where everybody's just on the same page for one goal and they move together. So it seems impressive because you're like, wow, they're literally thinking simultaneously, but they're not. One person is making a choice and the other three have unwavering trust and support that just go with it. So it gives it that illusion of step by step together.
And after that, they kind of move away from the whole tweezer game and they go into Catapult. And you asking about, do you think it was premeditated? I wanted to throw that question kind of back at you. Do you think Catapult is always spontaneous? Because I don't know. I've seen it a couple of times, and every time I've heard it on recording, even going back to, however many years, it seems like whenever there's blank space or feedback or something weird, that Catapult always snakes its way in there.
It's like an ongoing inside joke, maybe just like, hey, if this happens or whatever, like this is our response.
Yeah, that might be it. There might be a trigger for it that we don't know.
Right. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think we should look into that.
Yeah, we'll hire a committee. So then the set kind of returns to quote unquote normal with Slave to the Traffic Light, which I think was a typical Slave, and that means beautiful build and execution. Yeah,
very nice. I love Slave. I love it because it's fairly simple and absolutely gorgeous, and that combined gives you the feels without the flubs. Right, like some 1.0 songs are beautiful, but it's hard to listen to when it's a lot of mistakes. But Slave is usually executed perfectly because it's not overly complicated, but it's absolutely gorgeous.
They move forward with Down with Disease, which I thought was a very smart call after Slave. They've really become masters at, if not controlling, then certainly directing the energy level and vibe and layout of a set in terms of energy level and flow. And Down with Disease really kept up the energy and really made the show feel epic as opposed to just kind of fun. It brought some kind of gravitas to it after Slave.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Disease, in my opinion, I mean, it's almost like a counterpart to Tweezer in the magnitude and the jammy vehicleness of it. And I can think of a lot of great shows that have really good Tweezers, and I can think of a lot of great shows that have really good Diseases, but I feel like that maybe, I don't know statistically, that doesn't happen a lot where they're in the same set like that because they're both like powerhouses.
Yeah, they're war horses.
Yeah, exactly. And then to have a Slave in between is like, you're right. That has just set list value alone. It's a very gravitas, impressive show.
Mm-hmm. And to follow that up with NICU, which I thought was a really interesting transition. It didn't sound like the song for a little short while. And then after NICU, there was like a jam, which I never, ever heard before. I don't know if there's ever been a quote unquote jammed NICU before or since.
interesting. It's I didn't realize that, but it also with My Sweet One in the first set, had a double Leo.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, the feature, I mean, Fish had taken over the beginning of the second set, so Leo had to get back in there and shine again.
Yeah, and he does also at the end of the set, but before that, before we get to Leo closing the set, Fishman had to step forward with the weirdest part. You can make an argument that either the wheels fell off or it was just everything's in the mix right now, that he came forward for Jennifer Dance's sort of.
Yeah, I think I like to think of it as like the sense of humor of the band and having a really fun, crazy night and everything's on the table rather than it completely falling apart. I think that what separated like the fans from like casual observers was like that vibe of this is Fish at their greatest doing silly shit.
I think it was in the Fish book. What was it, like 1998 it came out? You know what I'm talking about? The
black and white one?
Not the black and white one. It has, I'll look it up exactly the details, but it's kind of edited conversations with each band member. And Page says something like, our ultimate goal is to get the band to play as if we're all at sound check, because like they feel they're most relaxed at sound check. And he said their ultimate goal is to play as if 18,000 people are also at sound check, that we're completely unself-conscious, that we have no ego at all anywhere. And I think Jennifer Dance is this very silly part of the show is that, they could be playing for like in the garage with their friends. You know, when Fishman comes up to a mic and says, I practice nothing. I don't know any words to any songs in front of like 16,000 people.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. And that I think is confirmed by the next song with I've Been Around. Yeah. Not so much the funness of the song, but if you remember, or I don't know if you saw footage of it, they were chasing each other around the stage.
I didn't see it, no.
Yeah, so like there's a famous picture from it with the band in line, right? Like running, like with their hands out. So to close out the set, that whole like sound check, we're just at a practice, like having fun. Even to close out the set was very of that energy, right? Like that fun. We're not in front of this many people. We're just running around.
Right. In case anyone was taking it seriously.
Right. It's like a reminder.
Yeah, this is all fun and games. And I thought this was an awesome set. I'm so glad that you picked this show, even though we're not totally done with it yet. I've said a million times on this podcast that I love set list games and turn on a dime segues. Everyone was obviously having a ton of fun. The musicians, and you could hear it in the audience. It took a good first set, and the second one made it a full, outstanding show. To close the encore, they played Boogie on Reggae Woman, was a dance party. Your crowd must have really been loving it. I know you said you were kind of in your zone, but I imagine no matter who it was, like bridesmaids and groomsmen, friends, whatever.
Everybody at this point. Who
doesn't like this, right?
Yeah, well, it's contagious. Even if it doesn't last, you can't help but smile and dance for Boogie On and for that kind of energy.
And to close it all out, there's really nowhere else to go. They had to play Tweezer Reprise.
Yeah, it probably would have been the funniest like slap if they didn't, but they did. And I'm glad they did.
It must have felt great though, closing the show and the lights coming up. It must have felt like you were all, I could only imagine the smiles.
Yeah, and the glow, the after show glow. It did have that the second set feeling almost like it had two sets.
Yeah.
In itself, and then I love the way they do that. They build on each other because you're like, oh my god, this set's so good and it's almost over, and then you look back and you're like, wow, we were only halfway through it. Like it just keeps going and keeps delivering.
So Tim, to wrap it all up, give us a reminder for Weekend Wook and the brackets and WookPlus. Where can we find all of this information?
So on Twitter, it's at Weekend Wook. Or at WookPlus on YouTube, youtube.com/WookPlus and WookPlus.com.
And any final thoughts about this show? Anything we didn't get to that you wanted to throw in there?
Talking about this and diving into those memories is really making me miss seeing live music. So I'm looking forward to having the band back and getting back to a show.
Same. Feel the same way. We'll all be there when they are. When they're ready, we're ready.
Yeah, I'll be there and I'll buy you a beer and we'll
back at you. You get the first set, I'll get the second set.
Perfect.
It's a 10. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And there you have it, my conversation with Tim Weekend Wook of WookPlus about July 27th, 2014 at Merriweather Post. As Tim mentioned, he doesn't know about all the jams and all the songs that he puts in the bracket. And as I mentioned, 2014 wasn't the most attentive year for me to know all about Phish. So our conversation had a few facts and information and figures that require a fact check. Tim said that he remembers seeing Bruce Springsteen join Phish on stage at Bonnaroo 2009, but he didn't remember which night of the festival it was. Phish headlined 2 nights of Bonnaroo that year, the Friday and Sunday night shows. Bruce came out during the Sunday night show, which was on June 14th, 2009. Together with Springsteen, Phish played Mustang Sally, Bobby Jean, and Glory Days. In the same part of that conversation, Tim and I talked about the 2009 summer tour and how the band played a lot of shows this year. On that tour, they played 27 shows, which was just about half of that entire year. It included a 3-night run at Hampton, a fall tour, and a New Year's run, all in 2009. During our conversation about cheesier Phish songs and Fuego, Tim brought up the Mike Gordon song, Let's Go, and that Phish had played it, quote, a couple of times. Phish has played Let's Go exactly a couple of times, just twice. The first time was on July 1st, 2016 at SPAC, and then once more later that year on October 21st, 2016 in Alpharetta. It has not been played by Phish since. Tim brought up some interesting theories that sometimes Trade tries to balance newer songs with old school classics in a set list. I guess that My Sweet One, which appeared in today's first set, debuted in 1990. I was off by just a little bit. My Sweet One was first played on September 9th, 1989 in the Dining Commons, which to me sounds like a cafeteria in Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont. A soundboard recording of that show is available on Phish.in. That's it for today's episode of Attendance Bias. I'd like to thank Tim of Weekend Wook and WookPlus for joining me today, Phish.net for providing all the information we need, and Phish.in for such an incredible sounding recording of this show. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show by leaving a rating and a review of the show on your favorite podcast app, or you could just tell one person about the podcast. Call them, text them, tell them, or whatever. Just spread the word. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next week on Attendance Bias.